Jeannie and I, my wife, had just come back from Macquarie Island in 1978, or the end of 77, and we were hanging about in Melbourne, and we were lucky enough to be asked to go and dig out Mawson's hut in 1978, early in the year. An expedition had gone down, and two guys were dropped off at Macquarie instead of going down further. And one of them was the leader, and one was the doctor. Well, it was both of those actually, and the other was the carpenter. So they asked for somebody to take over the expedition, and Jeannie and I went down on the Tala Dan with a party of people heading to Casey. We left Hobart and left Melbourne in those days, and sailed down to Commonwealth Bay with the Casey contingent, led by Tom Petrie, who was the assistant director. And we landed at Commonwealth Bay and went ashore. It was pretty windy, but we were okay to go ashore. About 25 knots or thereabouts, which is a sort of normal wind for Commonwealth Bay. We took ashore all our gear and immediately started putting up a hut as soon as we've chosen a site. And we put up a box, a freezer. It was 12 foot by 8 foot. So once it was 6-inch walls, it left 7 by 11 inside, and 4 of us lived in that for the next month and a half while we were digging out the hut. The reason we went was because there was a debate about whether it should come back to Australia, be repaired in situ, or some other course of action like a building built over the top of it and things like that. We left here having met Eric Webb, who was at that time I think about 90. He'd been flown out to Australia by Dick Smith and had seen it from the air. We met him at a party in Melbourne and had a long chat with him about what we should do, and he was fairly adamant at the time that it should stay where it was, which is fair enough. That was a general thing nowadays with historical monuments. We dug out the hut. That took us about 3 weeks or so. We worked pretty well continuously when we could, because the wind, we had a lot of gales. I think we had gales on 29 days out of 31, during which we kept weather observations. I had been a weather observer with the British Antarctic Survey back in the 60s, so I was more or less in charge of the Met side of things, which they wanted to compare with the results obtained by Mawson. We were working inside most of the time. We had a chainsaw and a chisel, electric chisel, and a couple of ice axes. And we had a blizz line back to our hut, so I was about 80 meters away, so we could go back and forth whenever we liked. It didn't matter how bad the weather was. And once we were inside and digging away, we were quite well sheltered, and it was quite reasonable. Temperatures were between sort of 0 and maybe -10 from time to time. So we cleared the workshop. The main thing was to find out what was there. We found out that, of course, that there was very little left there. Mawson had had a second year in the Antarctic after the tragic loss of Denison Mertz and missing the ship going back. He'd had a whole year to contemplate what to do with all the equipment that was left behind, and so he'd taken everything he could lay his hands on that he could sell, because he was down for another year's transport to the Antarctic. Had to pay the ship's crew, the people who stayed on Macquarie, and the winterers who stayed with him. 6 remained behind. So he took everything he could, to the point where they made jokes about it on the way back when they were loading the ship. So they pretty well stripped the building with magazines and a few things, like the shelf up here above us here. It was more or less as it is here. That was magazines and books and so on. No written stuff. It's all taken. They'd taken all that, and then we reported back. When we got back, we got picked up by the Taladan, and the French was called in with the famous French explorer Paul-Émile Victor on board, and we travelled to Dumont de Ville, spent a short while there, and then returned back to Melbourne, or to Hobart actually, to Hobart on that occasion. And we reported that it should be fixed in situ, that could be reclad. We hummed and hawed about taking the boards off the outside and replacing them, or in fact we were asked to order all the timber, which took about something like 25 years to get there, as it turned out. One of the rush jobs. And so that's what it took that long to get down there to be used. So that's about it, I think.